Well, good to be here with you, church. Please get your Bibles out or put your hand up and we'll put one in your hands for you so that you can follow along, look into the truth, open up to Matthew chapter 1. We are in a Christmas season now. We are celebrating God's greatest gift to us, the gift of His Son. And here's what I want to do this morning. I want to give you a gift. I want to give you a gift. Not a physical, tangible gift, but a spiritual gift. In fact, what I want to do over the next 3 sermons, this week, next Sunday, and then Christmas Eve, we're going to do a little mini-series. We're going to diverge from Hebrews, and we're going to look at 3 truth gifts. Gifts that are priceless gifts, life-transforming gifts, gifts that cannot wear out or break down or become irrelevant, gifts that will stand the test of time and will actually outlive time itself. And what these gifts are is that they're doctrines. They're truths related to the person of Jesus Christ. But they're probably not going to be the gifts that you might anticipate me opening for you at Christmas time, because they're not going to be about the storyline of shepherds on the lonely hillside keeping watch over their flock, or an inn that had no room, or a stable that became a delivery room. In fact, 2 of them are not going to be about directly connected to the Christmas story at all. They're going to be connected to the death of Jesus. And so let me just give you a justification, not that I feel like it's needed, but a justification for that, and that's this. The birth of Jesus has no influence over us, power to save us, power to transform us, no undefeatable joy or all-conquering hope without the suffering and the death of Jesus. That's why when we decorate here, not we meaning me, you wouldn't like it if I was the decorating committee, but it's why this happens right here. It's why the manger is at the foot of the cross. Those 2 things work together in a story. And so there's going to be 3 gifts, 3 doctrines, and the first one is right here. The doctrine of substitution. And by the way, doesn't all this look really good? Just talented, gifted, creative people, servants. Let's give them a round of applause. Servants in the life of this church that just do that because they love Jesus and they love you. And so they spend time decorating, and I gave them these 3 words, and there's going to be another word added to each of the next 2 messages as we unpack these incredible gifts related to Jesus. And I am going to begin this just to make a brief connection to Christmas with Matthew chapter 1, verse 21. This is the angel coming to, so open there please, the angel coming to Joseph, giving Joseph a message that his betrothed, his fiancée Mary, is going to have a child. And here's the instruction that the angel gives to Joseph, Matthew 1:21. She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. That announcement of the birth of Jesus is also a proclamation of the saving work that he accomplished by his death. The way that Jesus saved his people from their sins was through his death, specifically his substitutionary death. And so that's the gift we're unwrapping. Let me give you just a kind of a quick definition of the doctrine of substitution. You know what the word substitute means, or substitution? It's one person being put in the place of another. So applying that to the person of Jesus Christ, the doctrine of substitution is that Jesus is our substitutionary sacrifice, in that he died in the place of sinners, that the death that sinners deserved, Jesus received, and that the righteousness that Jesus inherently has as the God-man is granted to the sinner. Substitutionary atonement. Now, the statement of the doctrine is a little fuller phrase than that. And so we're going to brush up on just a real brief theological language today, okay? So here's the kind of the full statement that would be kind of categorized theologically for this doctrine. It is the penal substitutionary atonement. Penal substitutionary atonement. Would you just say that, church? I want to hear you say it. Yeah, you sound so smart. Let me just give that to you quickly. It sounds complicated. It's deeper than we can imagine, but I can explain it fairly quickly to you. The word penal, that's a legal word. And it's a word that refers to punishment that is imposed due to criminal conduct or a breaking of a law. It's a legal word. And then the word substitution, we just talked about that. It's standing in the place of another, receiving what the other should receive. Atonement is to make a satisfactory payment or amends to some offense that was done. And so penal substitutionary atonement. So keep those two ideas, the legal idea in mind today, a punishment imposed due to a breaking of the law, and the idea of substitution, of a exchange, one person stepping in for another. So here's the question. Does the Bible teach the doctrine of penal substitutionary atonement, or Christ as our substitute? And I believe absolutely, unequivocally, yes, prolifically, yes. I'm going to give you a really quick kind of rundown of that from Old to New Testament, just briefly. Let's build it beginning, the very beginning of the Old Testament there. What God did was God chose a people out of all the peoples of the earth to call his own people, the Israelites, and he dictated to them, prescribed for them a sacrificial system. And that sacrificial system had priests that were engaged. And what did the priests do? They would make animal sacrifices that were made in order to atone for the sins of the people, so that those animal sacrifices were substitutionary sacrifices. So here's the idea of the sacrifice, or the shedding of blood. And the scriptures teach, the Old Testament teaches, that the life is in the blood. The life is in the blood. That's a phrase that's said a number of times in the Old Testament, one way or the other. So if the life is in the blood, and what sin must pay for The penalty that it incurs before the just God, the righteous God, is death. What happens in the animal sacrifice is that the life of the animal, as its blood is shed, the life of the animal is given, so there's a life for a life. A life for a life. Substitution. So the idea of a substitutionary sacrifice runs throughout the Old Testament in the sacrificial system that God Himself prescribed, defined, set out, and called the Israelite people to follow. So keep that in mind. Then there are characters and events of the Old Testament. Matter of fact, a couple weeks ago, we just looked at one of the great characters and an event in his life, the life of him and his son, that is one of the most vivid, powerful pictures of substitution in all of the Old Testament, and that is when God said to Abraham, take your son, your only son, and take him to a mountain that I'm going to tell you about, and go up on the mountain and there sacrifice him there. And so Abraham made the journey, put his son on the altar and raised the knife. He was going to do what God had told him to do. And in that moment, the angel stopped him, and God provided a ram with its horns caught in the thicket to be the substitute for the son. That was painting a picture. And there are other stories that do that, but painting a picture of this idea of substitution that God wanted them to understand. And then there are prophecies in the Old Testament that would define the work of Jesus and His salvation in terms of a substitutionary sacrifice. And I think without question the greatest Old Testament passage is Isaiah chapter 53. It has 12 verses in it. And the 12 verses in Isaiah 53, 8 of them are quoted in the New Testament, and the quote is used to refer to the person and the work of Jesus Christ. And so Isaiah 53, if you want to spend some time in an incredible Old Testament chapter, just go through that. It's a great chapter to memorize. It'll pay you spiritual dividends, just probably beyond your estimation, but be a great verse to learn. Substitutionary sacrifice. Let me give you one more verse in the New Testament. Again, what are we doing? We're answering the question, does the Bible really teach substitutionary sacrifice? So listen to Isaiah 53:5, and then I'll show you one New Testament verse. Isaiah 53:5. Matter of fact, flip there quickly if you would, please. Remember the two parts, penal and substitutionary. Penal is a legal statement, punishment that is incurred because of a crime, a breaking of the law, and substitution, the replacing of one for another. See if you can pull those truths out of Isaiah 53:5. Isaiah, writing prophetically about the coming of Jesus, writes this: "But He was pierced for our transgressions, He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon Him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with His wounds we are healed." So let me emphasize this penal aspect, this punishment that is incurred and carried out. He was pierced, He was crushed, He was chastised, He was wounded. And then the substitutionary part, pierced for what? Our transgressions. Cursed for what? Our iniquities. His chastisement brought us peace. His wounds healed us. Both of those ideas, 4 different statements in one verse that really dive into the substitutionary work of Jesus and His death on the cross. And then go to 2 Corinthians 5:21. One more verse other than the main passage that we're going to go to, but 2 Corinthians 5:21. Here's what Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 5:21. Speaking of Jesus and the Father's work, cooperating with Jesus In the work of salvation, he writes, for our sake, substitution, for our sake, he, the Father, made him, referring to Jesus, to be sin, there's the exchange, who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. There's us receiving the benefit, Jesus receiving the sin and the punishment that followed. So there are, in this idea of atonement, there are a number of doctrines that are a part of that multifaceted truth. Kind of a great number of constituent blessings that are associated with it throughout the Scriptures. But understand this, all of those are contingent upon, they all find their source in, they all flow out of the doctrine of Christ's substitution, his penal substitutionary atonement. And so the verse I want to zero in on now, just an incredible verse, actually it's only a verse and a half in Romans chapter 3, is verses 25 and 26, the second half of verse 25 and verse 26. So would you turn there? We're going to remain there for the rest of the morning. So what Paul is writing about here, I won't read the pretext, I'll just give it to you what the dialogue here is, or the monologue. He is writing about the sacrifice of Jesus, and he's explaining that God the Father put forward Jesus the Son as a sacrifice. Put forward is the word that is used about God offering Jesus in the first part of verse 25. Maybe a different translation you have it, God presented Jesus, God presented him as a sacrifice. And then there is a question answered of why God the Father would do that with his Son. Just want that question to settle deeply. Let me ask it again. Why would God the Holy Father put forward, present Jesus the Holy Son as a sacrifice for sinful, rebellious humanity? Here's the answer to the question. Romans 3, middle of verse 25. This was to show God's righteousness, because in his divine forbearance he had passed over former sins. It was to show his righteousness at the present time, so that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. So what this text is dealing with, one of the key components this text is dealing with, is this. There was a great dilemma in human history. Beginning in Old Testament history, actually beginning right at the very genesis of time in the Garden of Eden, a dilemma began. That from the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve's sin, all the way down through the New Testament, Old Testament, into the New Testament, up to the crucifixion of Jesus, sin had entered the world in the garden, and then sin had continued to spread throughout the human race exponentially spread, prolifically spread, sin compounded upon sin. And what was happening, the dilemma, was it brought into question the justice of God. It brought into question the very nature, the attribute of the justice or righteousness of God, because God's justice is this: He always does what is right. He always does what is right. But here is a all-sovereign, powerful, holy, just God, creator of the universe, creator of mankind, and man living in ongoing, growing, pervasive, open rebellion in sin. And the nature of God comes into question, the justice of God. And so how did that happen? I want you to look closely again at the middle of verse 25. Listen to it again. In His divine forbearance, He had passed over former sins. Here's what that means. God did not deal with those sins. He had passed over them. He didn't give them what they ultimately deserved from His justice. He passed over them. He left them unanswered. And that lack of action against sin seemed to do this. Where is the justice of God? God has made a law. He said, here's what sin deserves. Sin deserves eternal separation in hell, separation from God and all that is good for eternity. And yet sins are being committed and are prolifically growing. Where is the justice of God? It is like a self-portrait here. Divine forbearance. That's a word about God and what God is doing, or the lack of what God is doing. And it's like a self-portrait painted by God that He is an unrighteous God. So mankind sins in the garden, and humanity holds its breath, waiting for the judgment to fall. And then man sins again, and waits, and again, and waits, and sin upon sin is compounded and grows. And how long did that continue? Verse 25 again, God had passed over former sins. That is a open-ended word. Former sins. That means all sin prior to the death of Jesus Christ. They're all the former sins. God had passed over them. None of them. We say, well, wait a minute, Brad. There's breakouts of God's judgment down through Old Testament history. Yes, but no sin received the full measure of punishment that God's justice demanded be carried out. Eternal separation in hell. And here's the rising voice of history, ladies and gentlemen, louder and louder with every sin. Where is the justice of God? Where is the justice of God? Now, what I want to do, for the sake of clarity, I want to use an illustration here. I want to paint a picture for you of a courtroom. How many of you have read the book John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress? We just read it as our life group that worked through it. And by the way, if you do read it, get the updated English version. It was written in the mid-1600s, and it is a little bit of a chore to wade through that, but the updated version is much more enjoyable. Amen. Masterful work. I mean, it is a masterful work. And part of the genius in that book is this. Mr. Bunyan, he uses names and titles of people and places in the book. It's an allegory, a story of a young man that comes to saving faith and then journeys throughout the rest of his life on the way to the celestial city. And it's about his journey there. And the people, his own name, and the people that he encounters and the places that he encounters are names that describe people's character and their virtue or lack of it. And so I want to just kind of use that thought in the scene of this courtroom. And in this courtroom, there are 3 prosecuting attorneys. And what are they doing? They are wanting to bring a judgment against the justice of God. They want to prove that God is unjust. And here is what they have as a mountain of evidence to use in their case. They have all the former sins from Adam and Eve to the cross of Jesus Christ, all of Old Testament history as a source from which they can build their case. And so what they've done is that they've done their work, they've gathered their evidence, and they've prepared to make their presentation to impugn the justice of God. And so let's listen as the first prosecuting attorney stands. And here is his name. His name is Mr. Incomplete. Mr. Incomplete. And this prosecutor, as he begins, he picks up some evidence in his dialogue that seems like what he's doing is actually detrimental to his case. Instead of speaking out against the righteousness of God, he begins to highlight the righteousness of God in this way. Times of Old Testament history in which God's noteworthy punishment against sin is seen. For example, God's righteous abhorrence against sin, he states, was revealed at the beginning of human history when Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden sinned against their holy Creator. And when that happened, God rose up in judgment. And what did he do? He expelled them from that garden of beauty, that place of his direct manifest presence where they would walk with him in the cool of the day. And so he mentions that aspect of the judgment of God, and yet he says, but that penalty was only a shadow of the vengeance, the justice that justice demanded against sin. All it was them being taken out of a place of beauty in paradise and put into a place where life would be more difficult in some degree, but it wasn't eternal separation from God in hell. It was an incomplete judgment. Where is the justice of God? Then he goes to a second illustration, and he said, wow, what a powerful illustration we find in the 6th chapter of Genesis in the great deluge. And what was the setup? Mankind had become so wicked. Described like this on the pages of God's Word, that every thought and intention of the heart of man was only wicked all the time. That's overt, prolific, sinful rebellion. And so what did God do? He says, He brought a great flood, a cataclysmic destruction of humanity as His justice stood up against that prolific sin. His vengeance poured down so that the flood waters rose on the earth and rose 20 feet higher than the highest nose could reach, so that all of them were destroyed, except the 8 who were in the ark. And the prosecutor, Mr. Incomplete, says, wait a minute, were they sinless? Was Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their wives sinless? Certainly not. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And so he says, I ask you, is God just? Why did He let those 6 escape? Why did they not receive the degree of vengeance, of justice that the rest of humanity received? So much for justice by water. How about justice by fire? And he says, can you see the mighty arm of God's justice being stretched out as the storehouses of heaven's judgment against pervasive, gross sexual sin? The deviation of Sodom and Gomorrah comes under the judgment of God. Can you hear the cries of the doomed as fire comes down from heaven? Can you smell the pungent aroma of thick sulfur in the air as the wrath of God is poured out against sin? And the prosecutor says, that is certainly a flashpoint of the justice of God in human history, raining out its testimony. Yet wait, he says, do you see them? There are some, this family, fleeing from Sodom and Gomorrah, fleeing across the plain. The wife doesn't make it, but the husband and the children make it across the plain, and a city is protected as they flee into it for refuge as the judgment of God pours out. And he says, wait a minute, are they not sinners? Have they not offended the justice of God? Where is the punishment that God said sin requires? And having provided that evidence and placed it on the table before the courtroom, he rests his case saying, God is not just. And as he sits, the second prosecuting attorney, his comrade, whose name is Mr. Insufficient, stands. to make his case, to present evidence against the justice of God. And what evidence does he bring? It seems most unusual. He holds up a goat skin and a knife and a basin. A goat skin and a knife and a basin. And he begins to talk about the unfolding of Old Testament Jewish history and how God came to the Israelite people and he gave them the outline and the details and the commands for how that sacrificial system was to work, through which they could relate to him as sinners. And the temple, the tabernacle, was to be built, and on a day, a specific day out of the year called the Day of Atonement, there was to be the sacrifice made of an animal. And the high priest was to take the blood and go into the temple and all the way into the inner sanctum, into the Holy of Holies, where the manifest presence of God dwelt. And there in the Holy of Holies was the Ark of the Covenant, above which hovered the manifest Shekinah presence of God. And under the lid of the Ark, inside the Ark, were the elements giving testimony to the sin of the people. There was a copy of the Ten Commandments that they had broken, and a golden jar of manna symbolizing the provision that God had given to them that they had scorned and complained against, and Aaron's rod that had budded, symbolizing the God-appointed leadership that they had rejected. Here were symbols of their sin against God. And between the Shekinah presence of God and the implements pointing to their sin, the high priest would pour the blood of the sacrificial animal, so that between God and sin came the blood. And what God would do is he would stay his wrath. He would turn aside his wrath for another year. And the prosecutor, having told the story, painted the picture, says, does that sound like a just God? How can the sacrifice of a dumb, brute beast pay the penalty of rebellion for men and women created in the image of God? It cannot be. And he continues, how can a creature of instinct pay the penalty for the sins of choice and the will? It cannot be. It is an insufficient sacrifice. So where is the justice of God? He's the one that prescribed the ceremony. It was done as he dictated it should be done. How can an animal sacrifice appease, atone for the sin of those who are in open rebellion, created in God's image, receiving of his blessing and scorning it in rebellion? And he says God is not just. And he takes his seat. And his third companion stands, the third prosecuting attorney, and his name is Mr. Undeserved. Undeserved. And he steps forward with his piece of evidence. And what is it? It's a king's crown. And he raises the crown in his hands standing before the courtroom. And he says this: God justifies sinners. What that means is God declares sinners to be perfectly righteous. He makes a declaration over their lives when they put their faith in Him. He makes a declaration, although they are sinners, that they are perfectly righteous. How can that be a just God? And He doesn't stop there. He says, look at the stream of humanity down through history that is continuing. Watch them. Do you see them marching upward to that celestial city, to heaven? And watch what they do as they get to the gates of heaven. These sinners, do you see them? Look at what's hanging over the gate. Here's what it reads, Psalms 24, 3 and 4. Who will ascend to the hill of the Lord, and who shall stand in His holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, and who does not lift up his soul to what is false, and does not swear deceitfully. And the prosecutor cries out, who hung the sign? Who hung the sign? God hung the sign. This is His heaven, and yet look at them, almost without number. The very dregs of humanity are making their way right up to the gate that ushers into eternal peace and joy and rest. And they don't even hesitate brazenly. They just step right over the threshold into glory. Where is the justice of God in that? And to make his point even more poignant, he begins to point them out. He says, look, there's Adam and Eve. Right there, the first sinners. And yet they walk right in and get a crown of eternal glory. Is that justice? And then he says, look, there's Jacob, the deceiver right there. The deceiver, look at him. He's not even pausing. He just brushes past the gate unchecked. And there's Abraham, the liar, and Noah, the drunk, and on the story goes. And finally, he says, oh, look at the red-haired man right there. That one with an earthly crown on his head. Look at him. That one that you hear whispering and whistling a tune of worship. He's got a slingshot strung over his shoulder. He's known by this phrase, a man after God's own heart. And the prosecutor says, do you know what else he is? He's an adulterer. He is a wife stealer. He is a murderer, first in the first degree, using the power of a God-given kingship to satisfy the cravings of his sinful flesh, and then killing one of his heroes fighting to advance his kingdom, killing him in first-degree murder. And he says, where is the justice of God? Where is the justice of God? And he takes his seat. And the prosecution rests their case. And silence comes over the courtroom. Silence that becomes loud. And you're sitting there as a witness, and you're thinking to yourself, is no one going to defend the justice of God against this prolific and seemingly compelling, sweeping evidence? Is no one going to vindicate God? Step out of that courtroom for a moment and come back here to Romans chapter 3. Paul gives the answer to that dilemma. Do you see what he says here? What is the chief reason God sacrificed his son? Romans 25b, this was to show God's righteousness. Chapter 3 of verse 26a, again, this was to show his righteousness at the present time. He's saying here that the Father put forward, he presented the Son as a sacrifice in defense of his own justice. The Son willingly went to the cross to defend the justice of God. You see, what is emphasized here, don't miss it. God putting Jesus forward, the Father presenting the Son. There is a picture here of the joint work of the Father and the Son in salvation. There is a joint work, not the Father compelling the Son and the Son resisting and finally caving, or the Son trying to convince the Father that this is the only way. No, this is a joint, united work of salvation in which the Father puts forth and presents the Son, and the Son willingly steps in to the role as the substitutionary sacrifice. And not only did the Father get personally involved, he is the one ultimately that sacrificed the Son. Isaiah wrote it in Isaiah 53, it was the will of the Lord to crush him and put him to grief. That's the shocking reality of this work of substitutionary atonement. It is every sin of human history, past and present and future, of those who are God's people. They are put on the Son. The Father puts them on the Son. The Son willingly accepts them. And then the Father's wrath rises up. Not like we get angry. Don't try to give God our characteristic here. It's a determined position he takes in holiness against sin. An eternally determined decision that God has as his wrath rises up against sin, and then hanging there on the cross, that wrath is poured out in its fullness. And Jesus there willingly receives that wrath, absorbs that wrath to fully pay for sin, fully satisfying the demands of God's justice against sin. That's what Paul is writing here. Now go back to the courtroom and we'll close. The argument has been made, the evidence has been compelling, sweeping and pervasive. Courtroom is silent. And finally, the defense attorney rises. And he says, Your Honor, I just have one witness and only one to call to the stand. And when he says that, the doors of the courtroom swing open. And up the aisle comes striding a Jewish carpenter. And that Jewish carpenter is carrying something in his hand. You can't quite make it out. Looks like maybe it's a piece of cloth. Yeah, that's what it is, a piece of cloth. It's got some stains on it. And as he passes you in the aisle, you see they are bloodstains. And he comes up to the front and stands before the table on which lays the evidence of the prosecuting attorneys, evidence against the justice of God. And he looks at the evidence for a moment, and then he begins to unfold the cloth. And when he gets it partway open, he shakes it and flings it out. And as he does so, the aroma of spices and perfume fill the courtroom. And he takes that cloth and he lays it so that it covers all of the evidence on the table. And then he goes to the stand and he says, just briefly, I present the evidence of my burial cloth. Meaning, God's judgment against sin is complete. For I, he says, was smitten by God and afflicted, led like a lamb to the slaughter. God my Father crushed me and caused me to suffer, and God my Father made my life a guilt offering. And not only is the judgment of God against sin complete, the sacrifice is sufficient. Prosecutor number 2. For I am the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. I am God's provided all-sufficient sacrifice. Then number 3, man's righteousness is deserved. Not because of them, but because of me. For I am God's righteousness incarnate, and I have justified many by bearing their iniquities. And the judge says, the indictment against the justice of God does not stand. God is just, and he proved it in the person of the Lord Jesus Christ in his sacrifice. Even though he had left the sins committed from Adam to the cross unpunished, they were punished in the Son on the cross fully, completely, so that it was a penal atonement. The law had been broken. A punishment was demanded, and that punishment in its fullness was paid by the God-man Jesus, whose inherent value and depth of suffering fully satisfied the justice of God. And not only is it penal, it's substitutionary, because he stood in sinful man's place. He took their sin, bore their iniquity and their shame, and in exchange gave them not perfect human righteousness, but divine righteousness. Freely gave that to them, so that the work I did on the cross, he said, is penal substitutionary atonement. Now, he didn't really say that, but the truth is there. It was a perfect work. That Son, which the angel said to Joseph, name him Jesus, because he's going to save his people from their sin. That is how he did so. So that what you have in this substitution doctrine, do you see that it's really objective primarily, not subjective? Don't get that confused when you're looking and considering that doctrine. The primary focus is satisfying the justice, defending the justice of God. First and foremost, objective, he's the object. Paul said, that's why the Father provided him as a sacrifice to show his righteousness. And then secondary is subjective. We receive by substitution the righteousness that we couldn't give. Objective, primary, and subjective, penal and substitutionary. This great doctrine of the substitution that Jesus provided by his death on the cross. Gift number one. Gift number two next week is redemption. Come back and let's unwrap that together. Would you please stand? Really at a loss for words of even how to express gratitude for the reality of the truth of the substitutionary work, Jesus, that you performed. And so just bow silently in humility and wonder, heart overflowing in gratitude and worship, and ask that your Spirit too interprets and expresses the very groanings of the heart to the Father. Would you just do that? Do that for me, do that for us, as we continue here in worship. Amen.